you could call it a revival, but for me it is a country refusing to deal with a problem from inception. And inception, we need to go back to the year 1895.
That far back?
That far back, when Kenya became a protectorate of the British. And when the British declared that they were going to alienate certain lands. Alienate meaning they were going to take possession and ownership of land that they felt the natives, and I use natives in quotes, the Africans, were not using. They decided that certain lands were not being utilized economically and therefore needed to be converted to, economic uses. And so they took the land, irrespective of who owned the land at the time. And that is why, for example, we have the perennial Maasai land question. Unfortunately, we then decided in the 1950s that we were going to carry out what were called land adjudication processes. In other words, we were going to use the English system of ownership to determine who owns what land in an African setting. And that then created all kinds of problems, because you had people that did not own land or did not own all of the land, because when you're talking about land ownership, it relates to very many things. We talk, when I teach property law, I talk of property rights as a bundle of rights. So in the African setting, no one really has control over the entire bundle. It's usually a bundle of 9 or so rights. So some is just to use, some is just to take fruits from it, but you can never, in the African setting, it was very rare that somebody could actually have the right to transfer that land. But
wait, question, is this what we refer to as community land?
Community land. Yes, so it's community because it is owned. Different individuals in the community have different rights to the same land. But so the English come and they introduce a completely different notion of property, which says that one individual can have everything, all of those, everything in that bundle. They can control everything in that bundle, including selling the land. And so they came up with a process of adjudication, and then we have to determine who owns this land.
This was in the 1950s? In the
1950s, you know, and this is around the Mau Mau times. So the Mau Mau have gone to war. Somebody is busy adjudicating and determining who owns the land, when the real owners have gone to battle. The real owners come back and find their land has been taken. Something happened in the coast, and this was through the Land Titles Act. And so, and part of the challenge is ignorance, because you see, you're dealing with an alien system. People don't understand that actually what is going on now through this adjudication process will then make someone owner of some land. So some people were not even aware, did not participate in it. They wake up someday and they're told this land belongs so and so. And so you find people that are squatters in their own land. And so that is a fundamental problem that we've had. And then we said the country refused to deal with it. At independence, the British then say, we will give you a constitution. We did not participate as citizens in this constitution. And in this constitution, we will protect existing property rights, irrespective of how they were acquired. So you've already created an injustice. Because you're already saying that the British took away your land, gave it to someone else. This someone else now has rights that are protected, and they're going to be protected by the Constitution. So an injustice is already established. How then do you deal with it? And then the British were also very clever. They said, how do we retain this system? Let's create an African landed gentry. And how did they create the African landed gentry? They said, let us govern through chiefs, the native chiefs, in terms of how governance works. So when they said, well, now we want to leave Kenya, to preserve our own interests, we're going to create people, we're going to give the property to people that will protect our interests. Who are the people that are most likely to protect our interests? It is the native chiefs and their scions. And so you had a system where the native chiefs' scions, I mean, their children were being sent to the Oxfords, the Cambridges of this world. They come back and they're the rulers of Kenya. And then the people that much of this property is also transferred to. Willing buyer, willing seller. They say, but we have given it to these people by a process of law. And so they come back and say, but we have acquired this land legally. The Constitution protects our rights. And so that problem is perpetuated. And then in the 2000s, we then decide, let's have a land policy. Let's try and deal with this question of historical land injustices. And so we have a very elaborate, if you look at the National Land Policy of 2009, it has very, very good provisions on how to deal with historical, what we call historical land injustices. Unfortunately, this then does not find its way into the Constitution of 2010. And so if you look at the Constitution of 2010, it is very hazy on how you deal with the land question. In fact, it's just kicking the way you kick a problem that you don't want to deal with, you kick the back,
yes,
kick it forward. And so it continues. You kick it forward. Nobody wants to deal with it. And then remember that you have to deal with these landed gentry. They still exist. They're the people that own the largest ranches in Kenya. And I can tell you from my experience that they were the biggest obstacle in getting this problem solved, the land question. And they succeeded in ensuring that what was intended in terms of what we say, this is how we deal with the land question in the National Land Policy, it never found its way into the Constitution. And so you have today, you will see, we created the National Land Commission, and part of it was to say, let us give the National Land Commission the task of dealing with historical land injustices. Again, if you look at the National Land Commission Act, we are still kicking this bucket forward. It is saying in section 15 that within 2 years of its appointment, the Commission shall recommend to Parliament appropriate legislation to provide for investigation and adjudication of claims arising out of historical land injustices. Has it done that? No, it has not.
Just read that section again. Section what of the National Land Commission Act?
Section 15.
15,
The Commission shall within 2 years of its appointment recommend to Parliament appropriate legislation to provide for investigation and adjudication of claims arising out of historical land injustices. Nobody wants to deal with this problem.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Dr. Ombongi, famously, we had the Ndungu Land Report. The provisions in the TJRC Commission's report in this regard as well. Tell us a little bit about those attempts at solving this question.
But before I go to those specific ones, let me pick up from where Professor Akech left. One point that I need to emphasize from what he was saying is that the land question, the land problem, has actually always been with us. Prof, it predated colonialism. It didn't start with colonialism.
Doctor, you're taking us even further back than 1895?
Yes.
Okay.
You see, what has always changed is the scale and the intensity of what we call the land question. In pre-colonial Kenya, the situation was not all that rosy as we always create it to be, or we want to believe. Inter-community conflicts, a number of them were actually based on land ownership, who belongs where, and the clash between the Nilotic Maasai and the Bantu-speaking groups, including over this region that could finally be called Nairobi, were common in pre-colonial Kenya. And the problem with the British, it predates 1895, because in 1888, the Imperial British East Africa Company acquires what could be called British East Africa, and then later on the East African Protectorate, and then in 1920 it becomes the Kenyan colony.
We clearly have a historian.
You can imagine that at some point in our history from 1888 to 1895, Kenya was a property of a company. Our mountains, our animals, our forebears, we were a property of a company until the company went under in 1894. And in 1895, Kenya was transited to the colonial office, and it became a colony and protectorate. You know, so what the company, for the Imperial British East Africa Company, was for was actually to use the resources of this land by alienating the local people. The 1894 Land Acquisition Act, you know, that officially started now alienating the local people, and of course subsequently the Indians, from their agrarian lands in the colony. So the land question, Olive, has always been with us. What has changed is the scale and the intensity of the conflicts around land over the years. Colonialism in its very nature, in its innate nature, aimed at you know, alienating the local people and all those who caused any competition in the most important thing in Kenya then was actually agriculture. Initially, Kenya was not important to the British. They just wanted to use it as a pathway to Uganda, because Uganda was their interest. And that is what made them to build the Kenya-Uganda Railway. It was while the construction was going on that they could discover that there were fertile lands here, which they could easily compare with what some glowingly described as the British Meadows and all the fertile lands. And then their mind changed, and then they colonized Kenya. And with colonization came alienation. Alienation, the essence of it was to dominate and, of course, control. That is where the land problem began. And that's what we inherited. What Prof describes as independence, yes, independence, but it was more of a transition of power from black elites to, from white elites to black ones. The problems of the country just transited to the hands of the black elites, and now leading to the challenges that we have had over land. If the British elites, the Lord Lameas of this world, the Grogans of this world, the Lord Egertons of this world, owned large chunks of land, independence transited that to the African quote-unquote landed gentry, if I may use that overly British description. And that happened at the expense of the everyday Kenyan. And we inherited that problem up to where we are today.
Okay.
Who owns land in Kenya? That question, we know it. The political elites, the founders of the Kenyan state in post-colonial Kenya, and all the people either related to them or their supporters, and the rest. And that is the situation that we have today. And when we talk about historical injustices, those are the roots. that could now lead to what we call the Ndungu report that highlighted all these historical injustices that we have had over the years and called for correction. Have we done so? No. Every time we have made starts, and ends in resolving the land question. Even many of the reports that we have had, the whole concept of the Ndungu report was brought in by the Moi administration in order to keep us a little bit busy, and then when the report was published, nothing was done about it, up to today. You talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, very wonderful report highlighting, all various issues revolving around land, conflicts, of violations of human rights. How much have we done out of it? Not much. The problem of land is here with us, and it will be here with us for a while, unless we decide consciously that as a country we want to resolve it.
Okay. Professor Akech, let me ask you this. So are you saying what has been missing, the missing ingredient, has been the political will?
Yes, and in our context, is political will ever going to be possible, given this very complex history? And to make it worse, after independence, we then had a very, just continuity, really, not change, from the British to the independent Kenya. We then continued with a very corrupt system of land administration. Very centralized, very corrupt. It is what you have at the Ministry of Lands. Nothing has changed. And also, from my experience with the National Land Policy process, we tried to change things at the Ministry of Lands. There was a lot of resistance. And they succeeded again. So what we intended was to streamline land administration so that there is no corruption. That has not changed. And so add to the historical complexity the corrupt system of land allocation. Remember, the president at some point could just wake up and say, this land belongs to me, this land belongs to so and so, and with the Commission of Lands. Who are if you look historically, look at the people that own land in this country. You can always trace it to presidential allocation, the Commission of Lands allocation, and a lot of it very corruptly. That has not changed. So until we deal with it, we are still going to go back in circles. And then it becomes something that can be ignited politically. It becomes a political issue. Every time somebody wants to rouse the masses, there is an excuse already. There's an injustice, an underlying injustice that exists. It's very easy to just light up. Yes.
What you talked about, perhaps you can enlighten us on this unholy trinity on the other side of this break.
All right.
We're taking a break, but we'll come back with that. We'll come back with that.
All right. Thank you.
All right, welcome back to AM Live. We've now been joined by Professor Macharia Munene. We are interrogating the land question and what we saw at Northlands, we saw, the attempt we saw in Narok, the Narok Ranch. Even before that, we had issues in Laikipia with the ranchers. Are we witnessing a revival of the land question, Professor Munene?
Well, it's never been absent, only a slightly lower toned. What we saw at Northlands and the copycat at Kedong is a heightening of what? Political activities. Because the Northlands was just a political statement, nothing else. That go along with those other things that are part of the political scenario today. But the question of whether the land issue has disappeared or can disappear is a tough one, because the land issue, the land question cannot disappear. It's long, and there are a lot of issues that still need to be discussed in terms of policy, and not in terms of who owns what. But exactly what should be the national policy on land. And when that comes in, then we have a lot of apprehensions. Whether we like it or not, we have large sections of the country that some people believe no one else should live there, which goes against the constitutional belief that if you are called a Kenyan, you can live anywhere in Kenya. The reality is, there are some places you can go and it will be made very clear to you, you are not welcome here, irrespective of what the Constitution says. So that's part of the policy challenge that needs to be addressed in the long term. The land use, how is it to be used? We have some laws that says in this place you cannot do this, you cannot do that. Should that be permanent? And when the times change or the environment changes, should the law change with it? I think our good friend here is a lawyer, so I'm sure he deals with those small issues when they come up. And, you know, I mean, then the problem with that is that it is not uniformly applied. There are people who get away with anything. The law says this, and they find a way of adjusting it. But nobody else can adjust. The discrepancies in application is what really concerns people. As to whether there are people who should be having what the Romans used to call latifundious, it's another matter. And now we are making people buy air, the flats in the air, with no, very expensively actually. So you wonder how things are going to go. So the land issue is here. I don't know whether we have adjusted the colonial policies properly. Back in 1915, when they said everything in Kenya is crown land, and the people there are simply tenants, and they're just property in the place, something like that. And when they went to court, the Supreme Court said you have no business complaining, because.
Can we help the professor with the? There you go.
So the Supreme Court was Judge Bath. Yeah. They said you have no business complaining because natives have no rights on land matters. Have we really adjusted those things? And what is it that happened at independence on the land question, which was very emotive? It was not very clear, although they told us that it's a willing buyer, willing seller policy, without saying up to how much or how low.
And which seller is this that was willing? And
who is sellers could be persuaded to be willing. Especially if they are known buyers waiting. And so you persuade the seller to be willing. The principle. And it remains, the very murky. And that's why we hear now at every point of political tensions, it comes up. And it is not going to end now. Although it's good that Ruto and Raila are talking, and maybe to lessen down but the issue of land itself will not go away until it is properly addressed.
Okay. Dr. Ombongi, there's something they've repeatedly talked about, and that is the politicization of the issue, both Professor Akech and Professor Munene. Perhaps you can tell us what inspired the lecture, The Unholy Trinity?
Well, what I call the Unholy Trinity, although some people were not very happy with the use of the phrase, but I still insist it is an Unholy Trinity, is the intersections of land, electoral politics, and identity, where identity here is basically ethnic identity. And my fundamental argument in this was just simple, that electoral politics in Kenya are ordinarily conducted, particularly in areas where there are land disputes, through the lenses of ethnicity. You go to Naivasha, you go to Molo, you go to Ban Forest, you go to Transmara, you go to an area between, Sotik and Nyamira called Borabu. The politics of these areas, electoral politics, is closely tied into community identity, which continues a pattern that we have in the country, that every time we want to address a fundamental issue, there is a tendency of us taking recourse to the small universes of us and them, we and them. And this we and them takes the dimension of communities. And hence, the infamous land clashes that we have had every election period. I wonder why we don't call them election clashes, but we call them land clashes. Because land is used as an excuse of saying, you don't belong here, so you have to leave. And this normally happens at election eve, which is aimed at evict, quote unquote, the foreigners, so that things can go my way. This has taken place in a number of places in the country before. So this connection between politics, particularly electoral politics, and land and ethnicity is what I call the unholy alliance. And this is common. It has layered its ugly head in the current situation, that we are addressing what we perceive as an election issue. And then how do we express it? Through what we are calling the Northlands, Kedong, what is the relationship between opening the server, for example, that we are talking about, and attacking a farm? It's the idea that the political elites always find the issue of ethnicity and land very easy to wipe up in order to achieve their ends in electoral politics.
Okay.
And that is very common in the country. And if we needed to address this issue, it should be addressed in such a way that it goes beyond probably what Prof will call all these legal instruments and frameworks and regimes that we have had. There is a way in which we need to work on changing the DNA, the social DNA of a Kenyan, in such a way that we de-emphasize the issue of our identity revolving around land.
Okay. And legally speaking, Professor Akech, this situation was, Raila Odinga compared what happened in, essentially what happened in Northlands to the situation in Zimbabwe. He said it could lead us down that path. But legally, is it possible to unravel this mess? Because it's just like, it's a tight ball of, because you talked about what happened with the colonialists when there was that transfer, I think is how you described it, transfer of power from the white elite to the black elite. And even after that, we saw what you talked about, Commissioner of Lands, those who own large tracts of land. It was by presidential decree. Is it possible to unravel that now, or do we reach a point and say, okay, what is behind us is behind us, how do we move forward from where we are?
Unfortunately, land is very emotive. I don't think it will ever be something that we just, sweep under the carpet and say it is behind us. You have to remember that, and I always tell my students this when I teach property law, property is first and foremost a social institution, not a legal institution.
Really?
It's a social institution, not a legal institution.
How?
That is what Dr. Ombongi is saying here. When somebody tells you you do not belong here, it does not matter what paper you carry. That paper will not help you. Because they can make your life difficult through very simple things. Denying you, they don't talk to you. Yes, you own the land, but nobody talks to you. Nobody socializes with you. You cannot cross their lands. They make your life very difficult. So first and foremost, if you own property somewhere, the people that you live with have to accept it. It has to be legitimate. And it is that legitimacy that has not existed since independence days. We chose when we wrote the land policy, we chose 1895 because that is when the British, through the protectorate, then acquired the power to make legal decisions over the territory that is now called Kenya. But from that date hence, you began creating very illegitimate rights over land that other people claimed. And these people, through generations, those stories never end. And if let's compare it to Zimbabwe. And I think, yes, Mugabe was trying to achieve some political ends. But I think in some ways I sympathize with what Mugabe was trying to do. I mean, not giving land to his cronies, but the intention was a good one. And the intention was forced on him. Because at independence in 1980, the British told, as part of the pact to grant independence to Zimbabwe, they told Zimbabwe, you will not change land ownership for 10 years. You will not do anything about this very unfair land regime for 10 years.
20.
Was it 20 years? For 20 years. You will not do anything for 20 years. Now, what are you to do in those circumstances? And then Mugabe then realized at some point that, but this is a lot of nonsense. We're going to have to do something about this. Unfortunately, it was not done in a proper manner, but that is a fact that I think is often lost. When people are looking at what happened in Zimbabwe. South Africa is a similar case, where you basically say in 1994 that we are going to maintain the status quo. In fact, you didn't consult, the South Africans were never consulted in a referendum. Instead, they set up a constitutional court that then determined, they established some constitutional principles, including, respect for private property as one of them. And then, so it essentially meant that South Africa could never change the unfair land regime again. So this is not peculiar to Kenya. But as you can see in South Africa as well, it is an issue that at some point, if they don't address it, will explode. Same with Zimbabwe, same with Kenya. And what is the common denominator in all of this? The colonial experience.
Okay. Professor Munene, what does that mean for a country where certain people own huge tracts of land? Swedes, And others, for example, in Kisii, when the president was in Kisii, he said, now you have to stop settling in your farmland, and we need to now demarcate. This is to be inhabited, this is to be used as farmland, because the subdivision has made farming a very difficult enterprise.
Well, it's a policy issue. It's an attitude issue. More important than anything is an attitude thing, which means it's an educational issue, because we need to re-educate ourselves on a lot of things. This land issue, like if I digress a little bit, you know, when the people kill each other, theoretically in the name of land, they kill people who own a quarter acre, 1 acre. And somebody with 500 or 1,000 acres just next door there is never touched. So if land is the issue, then it does not make sense. Because this person has just a quarter or 1 acre, and next is somebody with 1,000 acres, and may not theoretically be from there, but he has 1,000 acres or 500 acres, and he's not touched. So it raises the question, exactly what are we talking about? Because it does not make sense. Now, what is it that happened in Kenya and in Zimbabwe and in South Africa? The three of them had something in common. They were all white settler colonies. Large numbers of settlers. Kenya showed the way how to deal with these things. Whether it's the best or not is another matter. Okay? Kenyatta, Jomo, is the architect of these things. His excuse at the time, which in hindsight sounds good, Congo was the reason. What had happened in Congo? There was chaos upon independence, June 1960. White people were running, they came to Nairobi and some other places, and there was concern at the international level whether if there is that kind of chaos in Congo, which never fought for independence, what will happen to the land of Mau Mau, with the Mau Mau chief as the boss? That was the concern. And so this presumed Mau Mau chief wanted to assure the West, the British, and other people that it will not be another Congo. That was the mentality at the time. And for that, then comes up with this way of, say, look, can we negotiate? Britain, give us a loan, we give land to some people, and the principal protection of private property was the key thing. And the private property belonged to the settlers. So to assure them that they are safe. And so when he went to Nakuru and told the settlers, don't worry, you are just as good as in Kenya, and we want you to stay here. And in the meanwhile, we shall organize how we shall get some land, for the elite. So willing buyer willing.
Yes.
And it cooled down the temperatures. There's no question about it. It cooled down the temperatures in general, although there were pockets of people being disgruntled here and there and there. There used to be one politician called what? Bonafirimbi. You don't know. And he used to blow his whistle and people come out with rungus and pangas to chase people away. And he was an MP. Actually, he was even an assistant minister at the time. So to cool down those kind of things was an achievement in itself. And because Kenyatta had that authority, people went along with it because he had that authority. Kenyatta became an example to Mandela. And if you have been listening to Mandela, he said that he admired Kenyatta. And what happened in South Africa is exactly the same that happened here. And the difference is that Mandela was so smart, he knew. But the situation was so tense, and being the bright person that he was, you don't want to be caught in that thing. So he became a transitional president and ensured that the son of his friend Mbeki succeeds him, and then he becomes a big man without having to worry about that issue. That now is making Malema look like something else. Zimbabwe was a compromise. After, of course, the British and the Americans, they wanted Joshua Nkomo and Sama Muzorewa. And the people of Zimbabwe say, no, we want Mugabe. The deal that was cut was, yes, because Thatcher needed to get out of Zimbabwe, but must be seen to protect her people. And for Mugabe, they had to get that independence, because that is this. So they agreed, protect the interest of the Wazungus, the settlers, for 20 years. They had special seats in the parliament, and the land issue would not be touched for 20 years. That was the deal. And Mugabe was loyal to that deal. For 20 years, he did nothing. Because they had what? Yeah. Now, when 20 years were over or coming to an end in 2000, they negotiated a way out. The British government and the Zimbabwe government, they negotiated. And after Thatcher was eased out, and John Major became the what? The Prime Minister. John Major and Mugabe cut a deal of how they were going to help the Zimbabweans acquire the land with some loans. It was there. When Major was thrown out by the voters and Tony Blair came in, Tony Blair refused to recognize that what?
Agreement.
Yes. And when he revealed, he says, what's this? This was an arrangement between two governments, the government of Britain and the government of Zimbabwe. So when they threw away the thing, that explained now Mugabe's reaction. So what kind of people are you? And if as long as Mugabe was alive, he was very angry with Tony Blair. Whenever they met, Tony Blair would turn and go some that way. Because he would be berated. So that was the scenario in Zimbabwe. And as a result, I think Ken is your good friend John Lonsdale.
Yes.
He's the one who said that Mugabe became a bogeyman.
Yes.
Do you blame Mugabe for everything in Europe? Without agreeing or, to look at what is it that happened. Not that Mugabe was a saint. No, he was no saint. But also the background to that, the land crisis in Zimbabwe, is because the British government reneged on the agreement.
Okay.
And then, now, who is it that got the big land? Of course, some people got the land. There's some generals there, felt good, but it was maybe not enough for all the Zimbabweans to get a piece of the land. Those are things that need to be tackled even after that. So that I thought I would bring that background as to how Kenya's influence on the other settler colonies manifested itself through their land policies.
Okay.
Yeah, the interesting thing, if I may add to what Professor Munene is saying, the interesting thing that Kenyatta did that led us into ultimately, and the Kenyatta I'm referring to here is Kenyatta 1, is he created a very interesting situation where there were very clear interconnections between political influence and land that was underwritten by ethnicity. So that you end up with a situation of, yes, we get the loans to buy the land, but then who bought the land? The key political elites within his establishment. And Kenyatta, of course, with the kind and level of mystic influence and power that he enjoyed, the situation under his administration was a little bit calm, but tense. And we have actually inherited that idea that in the country at the moment, largely, political hegemony and land go hand in hand, and the whole scenario is underwritten by ethnicity and very strong ethnic sentiments.
Okay.
So that when people move and attack the northern lands, as we call them, or Okedong, then many people see it through the eyes and the lenses of ethnicity.
Ethnicity. All right, your namesake actually, Macharia Gaither, wrote a piece on that last week. And he talked about, he said it was this is an intra-Kikuyu dispute. Unfortunately, our time is up. I have to wind down the conversation, but I have grabbed their 1 hour, so I will seek to persuade them to join me when their schedules allow on another AM Live. I promise to have them back, Professor Macharia Munene, Professor Migaya Ketch, as well as Dr. Kenneth Ombongi. Thank you so very much for sparing, even if I have cheated you out of 1 hour, for sparing that 1 hour to be with us this morning. If Mandamano was on, would have continued. But now that it has been suspended, we're back to normal programming. My name is Olive Burrows. Good morning.